alternative routes. And the blue ones are the ones that it's the way to the northern area, right? So have a look at the green lines, and that is Santa Fe, right? And the Sheraton, do you get it? Good for you, right? Green line is the alternative route, red one, the real marathon. And if you cannot get it, this is the workshop you have to attend, right? If you get the train, no problem because you cross the park, right? I don't know. Costanera from the airport, we suggest that's the route, right? Because if you take the green one from Cabildo and Santa Fe, you're going to get stuck in Carlos Pellegrini. So see the green line coming right through the Costanera, and then you come from the back part of Retiro. Yes? Good. Retiro's right across the park. There. It's before where the railway finishes. Where the railway finishes, there, where they are doing that. Ready. And we are ready to start with the second part, building learning power in the classroom. Welcome, Professor Guy Claxton.
Sorry, we'll just wait while the technology gets sorted out. That's not what I wanted. Okay, so welcome back to part 2 of Building Learning Power. Are your brains full yet? If you say yes, maybe you go to your room or go home now. But if there's a little bit of room left in your brains, then I'm going to offer you some possibilities, small things that you might try out in your classrooms as they are, as I imagine they are. While you're waiting for iPads for all the children and wonderful new built learning spaces, meanwhile, here are some small things. Your classrooms have some walls, right? Good. You talk to the children, right? Yeah? Okay, good. Oh, by the way, I wanted to check with you. How many of you teach little kids, like up to 11 years old, something like that? And how many of you teach big kids? Okay, so it's a pretty good mixture. All right, so I'll swap backwards and forwards and give you some examples of things that we could do. So the things I'm going to share with you are just things that other teachers have tried. Other teachers who are busy trying to explore small shifts that they can make that will shift the culture of the classroom from the red-sided habits of mind to the green-sided habits of mind. When I use the phrase habits of mind, I use it generally. Some of you will be familiar with the work of Art Costa. He has a particular version of the habits of mind, but I will use the phrase more generally to include Art's habits of mind, but also maybe some others. So there are lots of different layers or levels of the classroom culture that we can think about shifting, tweaking a little bit in order to help to change that culture. So this just gives you an overview, just to remind you of the things I was pointing towards at the end of my session this morning. We can change the way we think and talk about learners and to learners, change the lenses through which we look at them. We can change the kinds of activities that we design for them, and that would include the way we organize them into groups, or we get them to organize themselves into groups. We can change things about our own behavior in the classroom, the way we talk, and the kind of example that we set for the children. You remember I mentioned a little bit about that this morning. We can change things to do with the environment, the way we give them access to resources. Obviously, if we want the youngsters to become more resourceful, we have to design learning environments that invite them to think about the resources that they're going to need for their learning. So, for example, access to the library, some of the kinds of things that Hamish was talking about, are things that we could do in any school. We can think about the way we evaluate students. If we're going to be serious about the fact that we want them to develop qualities of mind like concentration and resilience and imagination and collaboration, clearly we have to change the way we report on the children to emphasize progress in those habits of mind. So we have to write reports a little bit differently, and we maybe have to involve the students in self-evaluation and self-reflection a little bit more than we currently do. And then there are things to do with the culture of the staff as a whole, the way we work together as a group, as a whole staff of the school. And not just us, but there are maybe other adults in the classroom, secretaries, people who look after the buildings, and parents and other people, all of whom can contribute to this shift, this culture shift, which makes a difference, creates a different trajectory for the students as they're growing up. Okay, so what was I going to say? Oh, yes. So these are like practical examples. None of them works for everybody, for every class. So it's for you to decide. We're all individuals. We all have our own styles. So I want you to be thinking as you're listening to these things, whether each of these suggestions is something that you could adopt, something that you could play with, or you could adapt it, or whether not at the moment. I realized something that was going on in my brain when I was sitting in an audience like you. I was on the receiving end of someone else telling me all kinds of interesting, good things, and I noticed that there was a particular process going on in my brain. I made a discovery. I have 3 baskets in my brain, and when someone is talking to me, quite rapidly I'm sorting what I'm being told into which basket do they belong. The first basket is called obvious, trivial, just common sense. Everybody does that anyway in Argentina. I didn't have to give up a weekend and a lot of money in order to come and be told about this by an Englishman in a suit. That's the first basket. It's called trivial. In England, teachers have quite a sensitive first basket. They call it being patronized or underestimated or having their time wasted. Do you have similar reactions sometimes? Yes, good. But nevertheless, maybe 1 or 2 things I say will go in the first basket. Then there's the third basket, which is called impossible. No, the third basket comes before the second basket. Wait. I know what I'm doing. Sometimes. Okay, hold on. But I'm glad to see you're awake. That's very good. You have to wait for the second basket. Here comes the third basket, which is called ridiculous. Totally impractical, completely out of the question, might work in some completely different culture or on some different planet in the universe, but you come to my school with our resources, you talk to our kids, you wouldn't even think about it. Completely out of the question. And in between the third basket and the first basket comes the second basket. And the second basket is called maybe. The second basket is called, oh, that's really neat. I like the sound of that. I could do that with my kids. I like the sound of it, but it's a different age from the kids I teach, so I need to go away and think a little bit more about that one. Or sometimes there's a little corner of the middle basket which says, yeah, we used to do that, and it was really great, and it's got squeezed out recently, so we need to get back to it and do some more of it. Okay, so my job, obviously, I don't live here, so I have to make some assumptions. My job is to try and guess roughly where your middle baskets will be, and then I can flick things in the general direction of your middle basket. And your job, obviously, is to have remembered to bring your middle baskets with you. Isn't it? You will be surprised, you will be horrified as I was, to know that I did once find myself in a room full of people, teachers, all of whom seemed to have left their middle baskets behind. And you could just tell from the look on their faces, everything I said to them, they said, well, that's obvious, well, that's ridiculous. Well, that's just common sense. Well, that's completely out of the question. Well, everybody does that. Well, nobody could possibly do that. And my father used to roll his own cigarettes. And he used to say, you couldn't get a cigarette paper between basket 1 and basket 3. There was no basket 2. So you've all brought your middle baskets, haven't you? Do you have IKEA? No. Do you know what it is? Have you ever been to an IKEA? They give you this big bag, right? So you've got a big bag just waiting for more suggestions, right? Okay, but keep checking because we're all individuals, and what goes in basket 2 for some of you will go in basket 1 for somebody else or basket 3 for somebody else. So I just want you to keep monitoring which basket am I getting near. Okay, so here we go. So the way we think and talk about the learner, you have to be precise, you have to be explicit, and you have to have a sense of progression in terms of the language that you use to describe the habits of mind that you want to help your students develop. Explicit, you talk about them directly. So if you teach the International Baccalaureate, you already have the learner profile. But sometimes the learner profile just lives on a poster on the wall of the classroom, doesn't it? How long does it take before a poster becomes invisible in the classroom? 15 minutes? 30 minutes? So you have to keep using it. You have to keep the language alive in the classroom. When you walk around the classroom and you're chatting to the kids, you train yourself to be saying, well done, you really concentrated then, despite that distraction, didn't you? Fantastic resilience you had then. You really stuck with that longer than I've ever seen you stick with it before. Great bit of imagination, great bit of could-be thinking. Hey, you were collaborating with someone who you don't usually talk to, and that was working well, wasn't it? Well done. Right? You use the language, you notice examples. Particularly, you notice personal bests of your students, because remember, you're like a sports coach, aren't you? So you notice leading-edge moments, particularly if you have little kids, and you have a wall, a display in your classroom, and you have a digital camera. You take photos, you can print them out, and you're just looking for leading-edge moments that you can put on the wall in the classroom to encourage the students, to give them a glimpse. Yes, I look how I look when I was concentrating. You remember, there's an image of that time when I collaborated. I'm a little boy, and I'm 7 years old, and I was collaborating with 3 girls, and that was fantastic, because he'd never, ever worked with girls before, because he only ever liked to work with boys. So you create visible representations, low-tech. If you're a high-tech school, you can just capture them on the iPads and send them around to everybody in the class, but you don't have to have high levels of technology. So you have to, as I said to you this morning, this is just the starter kit. But you have to have thought out in your school, what are the habits of mind that you're going to prioritize? How many do you want? You can maybe start with a small number. If you teach 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, start with 4 or 5, and then gradually build them up year by year. And don't get stuck on anybody's individual system. If you want to pick a few out of Art Costa's habits of mind, feel free. I give you permission. Art's not here, so he can't defend himself. If you don't like the language of the IB learner profile, but you like the concepts, change it. Change it so it's more accessible, more concrete, more meaningful to the students. Even better, discuss the concepts with the students and get them to choose the word that has the most power for them. Like Paulo Freire, get them to choose the language that has power, that has potency to describe these concepts. Don't be frightened of using your own judgment. And keep changing the language to keep it fresh. Always try and find language that is appealing, accessible, meaningful to the students and their parents. Sometimes people use language that dresses these things up in fancy terms. They talk about metacognition. Why would you want to talk about metacognitive skills? I'm sure there are lots of good phrases in Spanish for describing the same thing, like there are in English. You can do Spanish and English in your schools. What's metacognition? It means thinking about what you're doing, taking stock, we'd say in English, of your approach, standing back and having a think, checking your assumptions, all kinds of ways that might be more appealing, might be more meaningful to your students. So don't feel you have to fall into the trap of using long words like self-regulation, like I used this morning. Right? Different ways of saying that. Self-control in England is a better phrase than self-regulation. People who write about this kind of stuff and talk about this kind of stuff, now I've discovered, need to be bilingual. There's one language in which you may need to speak to policymakers and politicians, because they won't take you seriously unless you use long words. But it's absolutely wrong to then take that language and use it with your colleagues, with the children, and with the parents, isn't it? We need to translate between those languages. So don't be frightened to keep thinking up new versions of what does it mean to get the children asking more questions, to be inquisitive, to be curious, to be skeptical, to be whatever. And I really make it a strong suggestion to you that you involve the students in helping you to think about how to articulate these things more clearly. So having a clear idea of what you want. If you don't have a clear idea of what you want to help the children achieve, then it's very easy to be foggy and just have good intentions, but not to be really systematic. If you're a good Olympic-level sports coach, you have a very sophisticated vocabulary for talking about skill and fitness, don't you? Yeah? So if you're going to be an elite-level learning coach for your students, you need a good vocabulary. Yeah? You need to know what you're aiming for, what your targets are. So that's the first thing, is to be thinking and talking about the language. Keep it fresh, keep it under review in your school. If it's starting to get dry or stale, refresh it again and get the children to help you find new ways of talking about those important concepts. Secondly, we're thinking about the way we design activities and the way we organize groupings in the classroom. I gave you one example from a primary school this morning where the children were thinking about the group size, the size of the groups. I was in that school, I sat in that lesson. Let me tell you about the next lesson that I went to. The children were a year older, year 4 in our system, 8 years old. When I walked into the room, I was a little surprised because the children in that classroom were working in large groups of 6 children. I thought that's quite large, quite a lot for 8-year-olds to be working in groups of 6. So I asked their teacher what was going on. He said that about 2 weeks previously, he'd had a very interesting conversation with the children in the classroom about the kind of working conditions that they might expect when they were grown up. And they agreed that often they might have to be working in teams, different sizes, different kinds of people, maybe from different countries, different ethnic backgrounds, different religious backgrounds, different professional identities, and that a really important life skill was to be able to work easily in teams with different kinds of people of different sizes. That was a useful life skill. So then the children in the class had decided, having realized that what they would do for the rest of the term was to keep changing the size and the composition of the groups that they were working in the classroom, because that would help them stretch their collaborating muscles. It would help them gain experience that would enable them to develop a useful set of skills for when they were grown up. Do you like that? Yeah? Involving the children in helping to design their own educational experience. Like the little footballers, remember? So don't be afraid, just as Sugata Mitra was saying this morning, to constantly be trying to involve the children. Always, here's one of our maxims, our mottos. Always try to slightly overestimate how much the children can do for themselves, how much they can contribute to thinking about the learning environment and the learning process for themselves. Don't play it safe. Don't always underestimate how much they can do for themselves. The schools that I grew up in always underestimated how much we could do for ourselves. And so we stayed stuck. We weren't given opportunities to stretch our ability to think about our own education and our own learning. So here are our 7 target properties: asking questions, checking knowledge claims, generating ideas, reflecting on what we've done and thinking about how to improve it, working well in groups, putting ourselves in other people's shoes, and offering and accepting feedback. Remember, this is not a definitive list, it's just an example. So how can we get the students to ask more questions? How do you make your classroom a place that is more hospitable to the students' own questions and own interests? Well, this is not rocket science. There's all kinds of things that you could do. You have another wall in your classroom, which is called your Wonder Wall. And it's full of Post-its, which are representation of the students' own questions. Before you start a topic, you ask them, what would they like to know? What would they like to find out? What are their questions? And you'll be surprised if they don't overlap quite a lot with the things that you need to teach them or want to teach them. So a visual representation of the students' inquisitiveness in the classroom is a useful thing to do. We talked a little bit this morning about checking the knowledge that you've got. And I gave you an example of the children in the history lesson who were critiquing their textbook in the morning. Well, how much more of that kind of activity could you use in your classroom? How could you make it fun for the students in your classroom to keep saying, as I said this morning, hold on, miss, how do we know? How could we check? Hold on a minute, I'm just going to go on my device and I'm just going to see if we could find, are there differences of opinion about this? All kinds of ways you could do that. Generating ideas. How do you make it easy for the children to contribute different kinds of ideas in the classroom? Let me give you one example of that. This comes from a piece of research by a Harvard professor of psychology, Ellen Langer, her name is. And she's done some very interesting research on just a small shift in the way we talk about the subject matter in our classrooms and what a big difference it makes. So I'm going to illustrate this. Imagine that you are 2 separate classes. Your big classes. This is one and this is the other class. And I'm going to teach you something, the same thing, with a small shift. And I want you to notice what the small shift is. So we're going to do a social studies lesson. Okay, here's the first one. So, Class A, today you're going to learn about how cities grow. This process is called suburbanization. As a community grows from a hamlet to a conurbation, there are 4 stages that the community goes through. In the first stage, there are 4 factors that we have to understand. Right? That's the first class. Now, spot the difference. Today, Class B, I want you to help me think about how cities grow. Some people have called this process suburbanization. They've suggested that there might be 4 or more different stages that a community goes through on its way. And that in the first stage, there could be 3 or 4 different factors that are important. Okay, spot the difference. Right? Now, it doesn't take any longer to teach like this. Okay? We call this, I don't know, in the fancy English language, we call this changing the nature of the verbs from indicative to subjunctive. Can does that work in Spanish? And in English. Okay, good. Very good. So informally, we call it is language and could be language. Now, if I talk to you in is language, how does that position you as a learner? What's your job? If it is, right? Remember it, understand it and remember it, right? That's all you can do. If it is, because I've already told you it is, right? There are 4 of these. This is what it's called, yeah? It's just a fact. But now, if I, with the same information, if I say to you, could be, what happens? Could be not. Could be 4. Let's see if we can think of a 5th one. So it immediately, the shift in language immediately changes the mental muscles that you're using. Now, you can do that easily in history. Yeah, you can do it easily in literature. Can you do it in mathematics? Can you? Now, I don't mean when we go into the realm of could be, that doesn't mean I want stupid answers or incorrect answers, but we could still use could be language, couldn't we? So if I ask you, what are 6 4s? You say obediently, 24, sir. Don't you? But if I ask you, what could 6 4s be? Tell me. Could be fraction, could be what else? What could 6 4s be? It could be a long number, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4. It could be 2 12s. Could be great batting. It could be, yes, could be a bowler's nightmare. Yeah, absolutely. Do people play cricket in Argentina? No, not much. Okay, so you get the idea. In any subject, when I was growing up in school, my teachers used a lot of is language. Yeah, that was just, they hadn't even thought about it. But if you want your students to be more engaged, more thoughtful, more imaginative, more critical as they work with the information that you're giving them, choose could be language, not is language. And you'll have students who bring more of their mental flexibility, their creativity into the classroom with you. Okay, so there's all kinds of other ways in which you might invite more imaginativeness from the students. Reflecting and improving. This is, at the moment, this is one of my favorite, as I said this morning. I think this is really important, things I've been reading recently. There's a really excellent book by an associate of Howard Gardner's in Project Zero. He's called Ron Berger. And the book is called An Ethic of Excellence. I think, I'm trying to remember the subtitle accurately. It's something like Building a Culture of Craftsmanship in Your Classroom. And it's about how to get students, particularly students who might be disengaged or from poor backgrounds, who don't have a lot of confidence as learners. It's how to construct tasks, projects, environments, challenges, which get those students to put their energy, to put their intelligence into creating something that they're proud of. By hook or by crook. Encouraging, challenging, coercing, teasing, all kinds of things you can do. Usually there's some tangible product that comes at the end of it. It could be a dancing robot. Or it could be a piece of writing. It could be a little book or an article. Or it could be something made out of wood, or if you're lucky to have a 3D printer, something that you've printed out for yourself at the end of your class. But developing that culture, that ethic of craftsmanship. An awful lot of students don't like the process of looking at what they've done, critiquing it for themselves, and thinking about how to improve it. But in life, that's one of the most powerful and important attitudes. Because as I said this morning, you discover the satisfaction that lies on the other side of that kind of effort. I don't know if have you ever come across an English actor, comedian called Ricky Gervais? Did you get the English version of The Office? Yeah? Well, he was the idiot in the Office, David Brent. Right? And the actor is called Ricky Gervais. He's quite a cynic, quite cynical, this guy. He did an interview in a British newspaper a little while ago where he talked about when he was at school, he was one of these students who did just enough work to get the grades and then messed about and then was the clown. And he said he was looking back on those days and thinking how he wasted his time because he didn't really try to his utmost. And he said it wasn't until he was writing the scripts for The Office in his 40s, mid-40s, that he discovered, and this was his phrase, which I rather liked, he discovered the joy of the struggle. Now, have your students discovered the joy of the struggle? They had it when they were babies, didn't they? It's like that practicing, keeping on going, falling down, standing up, pleasure of building their own competence and their own creativity. Yet sometimes the nature of the curriculum in school, the way we chop everything up, we mark it and move on, mark it and move on, mark it and move on. So what is the opportunity for more extended, a chance to reflect and revise, not just on your own, but together with other students? We did a project a little while ago, a little research project, where we designed students, we organized the classroom like an artist's studio. All the students were working on individual projects, but they were all working in teams of 4. So they were working on separate projects, but very frequently we would blow a whistle and they would have to stop and just explain their own projects to the other members of their team, ask interesting and respectful questions about the other people's projects, learning to give and take feedback, learning that reflective process, and learning to discover the pleasure that comes from that process. One of the enemies of this, of course, is packing the school curriculum too full of different topics. So you don't have time to do that deeper kind of thinking, that deeper work. But you can create it, even if only a little bit. You can create more of that kind of learning in your schools. Working well in groups. Well, we've talked a little bit about that. Adopting different perspectives. Have you come across, there's a very expensive piece of kit you can buy called a Harkness table. They're quite fashionable in America and in the UK. They're just a big oval table that the whole class sits around, one table. And the teacher doesn't sit at the top of the table because it's an oval. There isn't really a top of the table. You just have one place around the table. You would be amazed how the dynamic of the conversation changes. Instead of that catechism, everything coming via the teacher, now the physical layout of the room invites a different kind of conversation. The children learning the art of debate and building on other people's opinions simply through changing the layout of the furniture. This is all fairly obvious kinds of things. I talked a little bit this morning about designing split-screen lessons, and I gave you the example. We talked about here's that picture again of the boys doing that writing with their empathy specs. Let me give you a couple of other examples. So as a teacher is doing a science lesson, and she's teaching the students are learning about magnets. Do you teach about magnets in science? You have to do experiments with magnets? Okay. So, the lesson is designed, what we would call in England as a circus of experiments. A little group of experiments laid out around the room. The children are in groups of 3 and they go around, they read the little instruction card, they do the experiment, they see what happens. But in this case, the teacher is talking to the children about the range of learning muscles that they might be stretching. Actually, in this classroom, she has a washing line stretched across the classroom with a lot of little cards that correspond to the different learning muscles. In fact, in this classroom, they have 17 learning muscles, not just the 7 that I'm giving you today. And she says to the children, I want you to be stretching your questioning muscles today. What I want you to do is to do the experiment, see how the magnets behave, and then your job is to try and think up a new experiment or a new question. So see what they do, and then focus on what does that make us wonder? What would that make us want to know next? In other words, she's asking the students to behave like scientists, to be like real scientists. Because that's what scientists do, isn't it? Scientists look carefully at something and think up a new question. That's why they write grant proposals the whole time. Because they've looked carefully at something and they've thought up a new question. Could your children do that? Yeah? So it's just a little tweak of the activity. So then they all go and do the experiment. They come back and they share what they've seen of the magnets. See, we haven't lost the focus on the content in the classroom. We're just using the content as a way also of stretching one of their learning capacities. They share the questions that they generated, and then they have a conversation about whether some of these questions are better than other questions. What makes a good scientist's question? They ask themselves. And they had a really interesting discussion about the nature of different kinds of questions and whether some were good and some were not so good. So they're learning two things simultaneously. Just like in that history lesson, they're learning about the Tudors and they're stretching their empathy muscles. In this lesson, they're learning about magnets and they're stretching their questioning muscles. This comes from a classroom in Australia, in Melbourne in Australia, a long, long time ago. It's about like a year 9 classroom, 14-year-olds. And the teacher was frustrated because they kept making the same mistakes. They did a test and the same old mistakes. So one day, for 10 minutes, he did something different. He got the kids in the classroom into small groups, and he said, I just want you to brainstorm for 10 minutes, what are the common mistakes that you keep making? Right? I want each group to come up with a list of what these common mistakes are. And then he gathered them together and turned them into just a schedule. You won't be able to read this, which are just the common mistakes. We didn't divide by the same thing on both sides. We didn't copy down correctly from one line to the next line, and so on. So this piece of paper, now when the students do another test, they work together in pairs to use this as a way to scaffold their ability to self-diagnose and to self-correct in their learning. Now, my question to you is, was that 10 minutes well spent? Yeah? More engagement from the students, more ownership from the students. They liked having this piece of paper because they'd made it. Again, we see the students being collaborators with the teacher in helping to design their environment. Not in a big dramatic way, in an ordinary conventional classroom. Just one small shift to what's going on in the classroom. So you get the idea. One of the things that you could be practicing when you go back to your school is to take that list of 7 learning muscles, and just as you design lessons, design activities for the children, for your students, whatever age they are, think to yourself, how could I use this topic to exercise this muscle, to exercise their ability to adopt different perspectives, to exercise their ability to work well in different kinds of groups, and so on. Okay, give you a little bit of break. So you got 3 baskets, right, in your head, and there are some in the obvious basket, and some in the ridiculous basket, and some things already maybe in the maybe basket. just share the contents of your maybe baskets with your neighbor. Okay, great. Thank you very much. We need to rattle along. Okay, great. Thank you very much. So talking about designing extended projects, I just wanted to share with you this little example. On Wednesday this week, I was in a primary school in Helsinki, in Finland. They have a lab there where their primary school children are making robots. They're not just making robots, they're making dancing robots. And they have a competition, actually a national competition in Finland. Everybody looks up to Finland in the PISA tables. They have a national competition to see which school has created the best dancing robots. These kids are 7 years old and they're making robots. So this is the kind of thing that I and many of the other speakers today have been talking about. Actually, the really beautiful thing, that I saw some examples of this, they're not only creating dancing robots, but they're then choreographing dance routines which involve the robot and human dancers as well. So they're making movies of their robot dancing with people. They're 7 years old. How much do we underestimate their capability? And many of the things that Sugata and others have been talking about would capture that. Okay, what about us as the teacher? How much do you consider it appropriate to be a model of a learner to the children? In the old days, when I was at school, a very, very long time ago, the teachers thought their job was to be perfect, to know everything. But if we want the young people to grow up confident, to ask questions, try things out, admit when they're ignorant, to go through that phase of confusion that Will was talking about earlier on, it would be ridiculous, wouldn't it, for us to keep showing them models of people who always looked knowledgeable and perfect and in control. It would be completely counterproductive. So I suggest to you that one of your professional responsibilities these days, if you want really to prepare kids to be good learners in a tricky world, is to keep showing them, oh, I've forgotten how to do that. Could anybody help me with that? I think I've made a bit of a mess of that. I don't know. I didn't understand the question. Could you explain it to me again? To keep modeling being a learner. Now, imagine that there's a scale about being a model of a learner. At one end, 0 on the scale means you are terrified of being imperfect in the classroom. You're really addicted to control and knowledge. If a student ever asks you a question that you don't immediately know the answer to, you immediately become authoritarian and you try and squash their inquisitiveness because you feel uncomfortable. At the other end of the scale, number 10 on the scale, always like, oh, silly me, I got that wrong again. Oh, damn, I need some help with this. Can anybody help me? Now, everybody has their comfort zone on that scale. All of you do. So I need you to self-diagnose where you are on the scale from complete comfort with being ignorant and fallible to total clinging to the illusion of control and certainty. So what would your number be from 0 to 10 for you, your natural place on that scale as a teacher? -1. You need help, my friend. If anybody's 11, you probably need help as well. Because not only do you appear incompetent, you probably are incompetent. So when you've identified where you are on that scale, from Monday, next week, I want you to just try and imagine what it would be like to keep remembering not to be right up the other end of the scale, just one click further on in terms of being open about your own learning, your own fallibility. Just think through as you're falling asleep tonight, what would be some opportunities to be a little bit more visible as a learner to your students? Because it's really important, as they say in French, pour encourager les autres, isn't it? Albert Einstein is a good source of quotes about education. Someone once asked him about education. He said, as far as I can see, the only sensible method of teaching is to be an example. If you can't help it, be a warning example. So we should be better than that now. We should have the courage to be examples of people who are learning. So that's another suggestion. So it's just like, where would be a possible maybe for you in terms of being a more visible learner? Okay, let's have a little bit of think about the environment. So there's all kinds of visual tools and supports that you could use. This is a tool that a lot of our teachers use. It's called the riskometer. It's a little scale that measures the degree of risk or uncertainty or difficulty that a student has chosen for themselves as they approach a task. And in this classroom, each of the students has a little picture of themselves with a bit of Velcro on the back, and they can put their picture on the riskometer to indicate the level of difficulty that they've chosen for themselves. Now, what this means is that you design activities which create a little bit of option for the students, like how difficult are you going to make this for yourself, instead of completely defining the activity in the classroom. So if you want the students to practice multiplying two numbers together, practicing multiplication, the old-fashioned way would be you either have a textbook or you design a page of problems and you photocopy them and you give them to the students. So you did all the work. But if you want them to begin to get some control over the level of difficulty, you say, I want you to work in pairs, practice multiplying two numbers together, but you can choose the numbers. You can set each other problems. So if you want to play it safe, if you want to put your picture down the bottom of the riskometer, you can just practice multiplying two-digit numbers together, 11 by 23, because you pretty much know you can do that. You're just consolidating what you can already do. But if you're feeling brave and risky and courageous, you and your friend could say, let's try multiplying two 5-digit numbers together. Never done that one before. Don't know if we can do it, but we're going to give it our best shot. And you as a teacher approve of them, even if they didn't get it right, you approve of their struggle with doing something difficult. What this is doing, again, is giving the students some degree of control in a quite limited way, but it's getting them used to customizing their own learning experience for themselves. These are some dolls that one of our schools made for smaller children that represents different learning muscles. So this is called Ronnie. This is Ronnie Reciprocity, who's really good at the social side of learning. And Ronnie gives you a little sticker if you've been good at collaborating with other children. And if you're not sure about working with someone else, you can go and have a little whispered conversation with Ronnie. And Ronnie might give you some ideas about, some encouragement about whether you can develop it. That might work for 4-year-olds. I don't recommend you try it with 16-year-olds. It might work, but then again, it might not, because a lot of these things are very specific to different ages. So this is all about using the environment, putting up different kinds of displays, different messages that give learning messages rather than achievement messages to the children in the classroom. This is a 6th form student. She's Rachel. She's sticking up a piece of paper on the board in the class, which is her group's questions about the chemistry that they've been studying, because their teacher has set them a task. You won't be able to read this. He says, your task is to work in your group for 15 minutes to identify areas of difficulty or misunderstanding in the area of chemistry that we're revising. So instead of individual students having to risk putting their hand up, saying, I'm sorry, sir, I don't understand this, and then risking that everybody else is going to go, it's so easy, we know how to do that. It becomes a group task. So the fear is less of admitting difficulty and complexity. And the act of having to write these questions down and put them up to post them on the board for general discussion, this teacher found that after 3 weeks, this class of students had regained their willingness to ask questions. He just changed his teaching method very slightly. What we display of students' own work is very important. In one school that I worked in, they had a club of students who were learning to be curators, art curators. They were thinking about how to make a good exhibition. And their very first exhibition, this was the T-shirt that they had for the first exhibition they made. The exhibition was called I Never Finish Anyth. And their exhibition in the foyer of the school was a big exhibition of works of art that were unfinished. And with each work of art, there was a strong invitation to the viewer to imaginatively engage. How would you complete this? Where do you think the artist was going with this? To show the drafts, to show the sketches, to show the insides of the learning process, to show the guts of learning, to make that interesting to the students and to their parents. You should always make rough work valuable and interesting in your classrooms, not something shameful, but give the children an opportunity, give the students an opportunity to cherish their own working, their own sketching, their own developing of ideas. So let's talk a little bit about how you might feed back to the students your perception of their growth, because we have to know what progress looks like. You have to be able to give yourself an answer to the question, how would I know if my 15-year-old students were more resilient, more critical of knowledge claims, and better at working together in groups than they were when they were 14 years old. We need to know, don't we? We need to know whether our approach is being successful. And that's not an easy question. I told you some of this was difficult, but it's not impossible. And schools need to be thinking about how to work these things out themselves. So I'm just going to give you some examples of the kinds of things that a school might say about students when they're making progress. So here is a report on Sam. And the different teachers are saying Sam is getting better at looking carefully at what he's given, bringing his own questions into the classroom, asking when he doesn't understand, working with a range of other people, thinking things through carefully, seeing how he can improve what he's done. Molly is becoming more resilient in the face of difficulty. She doesn't give up so quickly, more imaginative in her writing, more thoughtful about her own work, more skeptical about what she reads, more careful in her own checking of her own work, more willing to push herself. See, what's important about these things is these words. We're training ourselves to notice improvements in the students. Sam is getting better at these things. Molly is becoming more of these things. Teachers often in my country are not very good at noticing these kinds of things about students. You notice their achievement, you notice their results, you notice their test scores, you notice if they're turning up, you notice if they're behaving well or not. This is another thing to notice about them. And maybe it's not so familiar. We need to be helping to train ourselves to notice these kinds of changes better. And even better is to get students, to train the students to become self-evaluative, to notice their own progress and to diagnose their own process. A couple of months ago, I was in Sydney, in Australia, in a school in a poor area of town, Bankstown Girls' School. And I saw a piece of writing that this girl, Debbie No, had done. She's in year 9, 14 years old. And if you just look through, this is her writing, you might be impressed with the level of sophistication, of her ability to reflect on herself as a learner. The language is quite extraordinary. I don't think I asked the right questions to intensify my learning. Would your students say that? Yeah? You can feel her taking responsibility for her own learning. And then she says, what I need to improve on for the next lesson is I need to talk with my group more. We need to get clearer about the roles and responsibilities that we're taking in the group. And I need to get better at persevering through the tough times. That's impressive, and it will not surprise you that students who are more articulate and more thoughtful about themselves as learners get better test scores. So keep reminding yourself this isn't either or, this is looking for both kinds of things that we can develop. So, I'm out of time. The last thing I just wanted to say was the importance of us collaborating together. This is a book that lots of teachers have been reading recently. Big effects on students' levels of achievement occur when teachers become learners about their own teaching. The more we are thoughtful, experimenting, tinkering, trying different little things with our students and telling the students what we're trying, involving them as critical consumers of our own teaching, not so that they can dump years of frustration on us when we invite it, but so they can help us become better as teachers. The more we have that attitude, the more two things happen for those students. They will get better test scores because they're more engaged, more involved. They feel safer to be around teachers who are also themselves learners. And secondly, and much more importantly, they're developing those habits of mind that will help them do well for the rest of their lives. And that's the most important thing we could be doing. The final message, we know a lot about how to do this. Lots of information from David Perkins and his group at Harvard, from Art Coster and his group, from my own group, from John Hattie's group in Melbourne, and from Carol Dweck. We're not short of good ideas. What we desperately need now is roomfuls of teachers like you who are, as I said at the end of my first talk, who are willing to try a little bit something different on Monday, to keep at it, not immediately to give up instantly if the students don't like it. That's why you need to try small things, but be persistent, be relentless, and then see if it makes a difference to the way those students function. Then, week by week, month by month, we will shift the climate of the classroom. So our classrooms become places that incubate powerful learning. And there is nothing more important to sit at the heart of our education than the intention to help those young people become powerful, confident, and enthusiastic learners. Think back to Will Richardson's slide about the importance of that motivation of learning. Productive learning is when students want to know more. And there are lots of small practical things you can do to help to build that culture. I hope you've got something in your middle baskets. And I'm sorry I'm slightly over time. Thanks.
Thank you, Guy. Thank you so much for your second session. While this session was taking place, I have to announce that the Tokyo delegation was the winner for the 2020 Olympic Games. And they are celebrating over there, right? The delegation is at the hotel. They are celebrating at their style, right? That's why you haven't heard them. I want to refresh your memories. We are now coming with Will Richardson, right? His second presentation. If you want to have a look at science at primary school level, this will take place at the Catalina's room. And if you are ready for tonight, 7 o'clock drinks. We did it very early so that you stayed. 7 o'clock drinks, cocktails, early dinner, 7:30, band, dancing, and rock and roll, right? See you there. You leave this room to the left. Retiro room.